My name is Mike Young. I'm Vice President for Academic Affairs and Head of the Laboratory of Genetics here at the Rockefeller University. President Mark Tessier-Levine sends his regrets. He hoped to be here but was called out of town and asked me to step in and take his place. This evening we're gathered to celebrate the presentation of the university's Lewis Thomas Prize for writing about science to Dr. Atul Gawande. Thank you for joining us. Before introducing our honoree, I want to share a little bit of the history about this prize. The Rockefeller University established this prize in 1993 in the name of its first recipient, writer, educator, and physician scientist Lewis Thomas. The award honors a rare individual who bridges the worlds of science and humanities, whose voice and vision can tell us about science's aesthetic and philosophical dimensions, providing not merely new information, but a cause for reflection and even revelation. As a physician and a writer, Lewis Thomas perfectly embodied this description. Through his thoughtful essays in the New England Journal of Medicine, Lewis Thomas shared insights on science, nature, and the human body in clear and elegant prose. A compilation of some of these essays, entitled The Lives of a Cell, was published in 1974 and was recognized by the National Book Award. I'd like to acknowledge Jesse Ausubel, who chairs the Lewis Thomas Prize Selection Committee, and thank Jesse and members of the committee for their work in selecting our honoree tonight. And now I'd like to introduce and welcome the recipient of the 2014 Lewis Thomas Prize, Dr. Atul Gawande, whom we honor this evening. Dr. Gawande earned his bachelor's degree in biology and political science from Stanford University, his master's degree in philosophy from Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, his M.D. from Harvard Medical School, and an M.P.H. from the Harvard School of Public Health. He now practices general and endocrine surgery at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston and is a professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Harvard School of Public Health and professor of surgery at Harvard Medical School. In addition, Dr. Gawande is director of Ariadne Labs, a center for health systems innovation, and a co-founder and chairman of Lifebox, an international not-for-profit implementing systems and technology to reduce surgical deaths globally. He's a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine and writes the Notes of a Surgeon column for the New England Journal of Medicine. Dr. Gawande is the recipient of numerous awards and recognitions, including the 2006 MacArthur Fellowship for his work investigating and articulating modern surgical practices and medical ethics. With the Lewis Thomas Prize, we recognize Dr. Gawande for his 3 best-selling books: compilations, A Surgeon's Note on an Imperfect Science, which was a finalist for the National Book Award in 2002 and has been published in over 100 countries. Better, A Surgeon's Notes on Performance, and the Checklist Manifesto, How to Get Things Right, which was a New York Times bestseller in 2010. Through his books, Dr. Gawande achieves the ideal of the Lewis Thomas Prize, which is to write about a science in a way that inspires others to think about it from a new perspective. Dr. Gawande is not only changing the way we think about best practices in medicine, but also about the U.S. healthcare system. In a few minutes, we will hear Dr. Gawande speak about doctor as writer, writer as doctor, but first we will present him with the award. Dr. Gawande, would you please join me on stage? So It's my pleasure first to read the citation that's being presented to Dr. Gawande this evening. With the deft precision one might expect of a highly accomplished surgeon, Atul Gawande delves into the conflicts and challenges of the physician's practice. His incisive examinations of tasks ranging from simple diagnosis to complex surgery expose the delicate balance of knowledge and intuition that is inherent in every medical decision. Dr. Gawande is a surgeon at Brigham and Women's Hospital and a professor of surgery at Harvard Medical School, working at the front lines of medicine. He writes from his experience, but with the curiosity of a scientist and the inspiration of a poet. Atul Gawande has described the appeal of his profession as the alterable moment, the fragile but crystalline opportunity for one's know-how, ability, or just gut instinct to change the course of another's life for the better. His accomplishments as a physician and public health researcher are informed by his understanding of philosophy and ethics. As the author of many essays and the books Complications, Better, and the Checklist Manifesto, Dr. Gawande dares to probe the dimensions of human strength and frailty in the medical realm. The critical intelligence and emotional sensitivity of his reporting are matched by his courage in exploring the deeper themes that arise when one aspires to live one's life in service to humankind. Through his skillful and compassionate literary rendering of basic truths and complex moral dilemmas, Atul Gawande has brought forth insights that profoundly affect physicians and their patients. He has achieved the ideal of the Lewis Thomas Prize for writing about science. It's my honor to present Dr. Atul Gawande with the Lewis Thomas Prize for writing about science. I think they want to take it. I've got a couple of more things to say. On behalf of President Mark Tessier-Levine, the Distinguished Selection Committee, and all of us here today, we congratulate you on this award, and it's now my pleasure to turn over the podium to our honoree, Dr. Gawande.
This is such a great honor. Lewis Thomas was one of my heroes, and one sign of this is that shortly after I got to write my first book, and it came out, I was asked to do a reading at a rock club in Boston. The deal was, it was called Cover to Cover, and the deal was that that 3 bands would play and 3 writers would read. And we all had to cover our favorite folks. So the bands only played their favorite musicians, and we only read our favorite writers. And what surprised me the most was I was going to go on last at midnight. And I thought, what can you read that would hold an audience's attention about the stuff I care about at midnight after 3 rock bands and a drunk audience is in front of you? And I decided to read Lewis Thomas. His essay on ants and how scientists are really like ants, building our hills of knowledge and information and passing it bit by bit as we build this edifice much, much larger than ourselves. And people were heckling and yelling at all of the activity in the essay, and I knew I'd picked the right one. Lewis Thomas, one of my favorite parts of his story was how when he was in medical school, that he put himself through medical school in part by selling poetry to the Atlantic Monthly and selling his blood on donation, neither of which you can do nowadays. Poets can't make their way through medical school selling their poetry, and no one lets you sell your blood anymore either. But from that moment on, I thought, this is the guy to read every single thing he's written, and I did. I've been in this funny business of doctoring and writing now for about 15 years, and I was asked to try to explain a little bit about that, and I thought the way to do it would be to both talk a little and read from my very first piece that I wrote. I was not yet someone who could imagine I would be called a writer. I was barely a doctor. It was 1997. It was my second year of surgical training, and Slate magazine, internet magazine which had just started back then, had offered to have me do a little bit of writing for them. And so what I started was a kind of blog, only we didn't know you'd call it a blog in 1997, writing in our Netscape browsers. But this is how it went. I had one week where I had 5 daily installments. And it started with day 1, a Sunday, late night in spring, 1997. And I just described what was going on. This weekend I was on duty, which meant starting work at 5 a.m. on Saturday and not going home until Monday night. My service, a cancer surgery service, had a handful of patients. A frightened college student had a lymphoma that triggered his spleen to sponge up his platelets, which you need for blood to clot. We had to take out his spleen before any unstoppable spontaneous bleeding started. An irrepressibly cheerful woman in her 50s had a cancer in her thigh. We excised all her quadriceps muscles and then replaced them with some of her hamstrings so she could get out of a chair or walk upstairs again. My other patients came in for mastectomies, but it strikes me that each had chosen a different way to cope with the reality that they were having one of their breasts removed. The patients included a 39-year-old who preferred no reconstruction, a 75-year-old who took a saline implant, and a 37-year-old who wanted the most realistic looking breast possible, one rebuilt from her abdominal muscle, and for the nipple, a skin graft. I had one young patient with bilateral mastectomies who wanted to be the first Playboy pinup with wholly reconstructed breasts. Everyone was recovering uneventfully. There are few emergencies on a cancer service. My sleep was disturbed only occasionally. The last time I was on weekend duty, I was at another hospital, and it was far busier, more like usual. 50-pager calls a day, 4 patients in intensive care needing to be checked every 3 hours. Midnight on Saturday, I needed to go to the bathroom, and my pager goes off. An obese man in the ER has a rectal abscess. I figure that can wait and head to the bathroom, but then I get paged again. The ICU needs me stat. A patient can't breathe. The pager goes off again while I'm fixing the problem. A Jehovah's Witness is bleeding from his colon. He's already lost half his blood volume. He refuses a transfusion. I consider going to the bathroom, but think better of it. I go and I talk to the patient. No surgery, no blood, he says. He knows he can die. So we hooked up monitors, intravenous lines, a bladder catheter. We give him fluids. The bleeding stops. I talk to my chief resident, my boss. I fill out the inevitable paperwork. I go to the ER. The obese man is angry I took so long. I give him numbing medication and use a knife to open the abscess. Pus pours out. The stench is fearsome. He feels better. More paperwork. 3 a.m., I finally go to the bathroom. The Jehovah's Witness has checked with his church. He can have surgery but no blood. Then he has another bloody bowel movement. His hematocrit, his blood count, drops to 15%. Normal is around 45%. Surgery or not, he's going to die. Amazingly, at 12%, he is still alive. Stone-faced and scared, he changes his mind. He wants the blood. Later, having revived him to a count of more than 30%, we took out his colon, and he made it home the next week. So I'm the junior resident on duty for my service, a cancer surgery service this weekend, arriving at the hospital at 5:30 a.m. Saturday and staying straight through looking after the patients until tomorrow night, when I'll finally go home. It's been a manageable weekend with only a few patients in-house. When I wrote that first installment, I had no idea I would become anyone people would call a writer. But 20 months later, I wrote my first piece for The New Yorker, and 24 months after that, I began pulling my first book together. And people write me and ask how they might do this kind of work in writing, and I honestly don't know what to tell them. I'm not sure. They want to know, how did I come to do this? And looking from the position of someone that day writing that and going forward, I think it was completely opaque to me what I was starting by doing that. But looking backwards, it has this appearance of being logical, explainable. We have certain theories about why you become what you become. And the most common, especially about the arts, is that you are born to do what you do. And I know for sure that that is not true. I grew up with no books in the house or at least not many. My mother was a pediatrician. My father was a urologist. The only books in the house were their journals. the pediatrics journals and the urology journals sitting on our table with those, grim urology pictures on the front, greeting people as they walk in the door. In high school, I grew up in Athens, Ohio, a small town, and went to a rural high school that had, as a requirement, you only had to read one book cover to cover in high school in any given quarter. And that was fine with me. When I went to college, I got a C on my first paper in freshman writing at Stanford. And if you know anything about Stanford, you know how hard it is to get a C. I took a college fiction writing class once while I was there, but it was mainly because there was a girl taking it that I had a rather keen interest in. We married a few years later. And the professor, halfway through, took me aside and suggested I might find something to do other than writing. And he was completely right. I can tell a lot of these stories, unfortunately. After college, I used to write rock songs with the most abominable lyrics. Oh, the pain, oh, the misery, that kind of Morrissey 80s kind of thing. I liked to imagine myself as some kind of writer or artist, but I never took the time to actually write, to think carefully and rigorously and unsentimentally about words and ideas. What I liked imagining really was just being important. And you know where that gets you. Nowhere. Day 2, Monday afternoon. The first hour or so before sunup is a pell-mell scramble to see all the patients. This is pre-rounds. I check lab results, vital signs, how everyone's feeling. They hardly ever know, since I have to wake them up to ask. And then I wangle them around to check their lungs, bellies, hearts, wounds. Now they're awake. Then I join the other juniors to round with a senior resident. We whiz by everyone again, the senior double-checking that we didn't miss anything and giving us our orders for the day. Some patients are to go home. They need prescriptions, instructions, visiting nursing, follow-up appointments. I have that young splenectomy patient who has a fever. I'm told to get a chest x-ray, blood, and urine cultures and get him out of bed more, and I plan on keeping a close eye on him today. I continue in a controlled frenzy to do everything by 7:30 when operating begins. I'm assigned 4 breast cancer operations. The senior keeps the more difficult cases for herself. I make it downstairs, just in time to catch my first patient before she goes into the OR. She's having a breast biopsy. Hi, I'm Dr. Gawande. I'll be assisting your surgeon. Is everything going all right so far? I extend a confident hand, give my best urine good hand smile, make sure to pose my empathetic question, but she gives me a withering glare. No residents are doing my surgery, she says. I try to explain, I just assist. Her attending is always in charge, but the whole edifice of medical training is based on a kind of subterfuge. I know I'm not just an extra set of hands. I hold the knife in most of today's cases. I have the table raised to my 6-foot-plus height. I struggle to get a breast cancer out through a tiny incision without violating the mass or burning the skin with the electrocautery. I remove the lymph nodes from an armpit and avoid damaging critical nerves or puncturing delicate nearby arteries. The attending surgeon leaves to talk to family while I sew the skin closed. Yet it's not as simple as that either. There's a distinction between the pilot and the navigator. A pilot needs a modicum of skill, but beyond that, the navigator is in charge. The attending draws the dotted line where I am to cut. She warns me if I'm too close to the cancer or too far. She tells me how she wants the skin sutured. Many cases are too complex to do without both of us playing our roles. And if she loses confidence in me, she utters the dreaded words, "Switch sides." And I slouch, shamefaced and silent, away from the operator's side of the table. In the end, for a given attending, the quality of the operation varies little, despite the variety of residents who help him or her. To this first patient of the day, however, her surgery is more like the NBA Finals than steering a submarine. She wants Jordan shooting the ball. Can I just point out I hadn't quite figured out how to make metaphors that were not as horrible as that one? She is unrelenting. The surgeon caves, dismissing me, since she can handle the biopsy without any extra help. Where I eventually ended up after college was medical school. And if I was going to be born to do anything, medicine was it. I'm an Indian child of two Indian parents who happen to both be doctors. I don't like the idea that I became a doctor just because my parents are doctors. I like to think of myself as an autonomous being, the master of my own fate. And, but it makes you wonder, doesn't it? One of my favorite books was Tobias Wolff's memoir, This Boy's Life. I don't know how many of you know this book from a while ago. It's the tale of this young boy, 10 years old where it starts, who was growing up in Concrete, Washington. He was the son of a loved but poor and single mother, had a malevolent stepfather, and decided by the time he was 12 years old that he was meant for a better life. So the following year, when he got into high school, he stole some transcript paper, made up a beautiful transcript for himself, several stunning letters of recommendation, and got himself into a private Eastern boys' school on full scholarship. From there, he went to Princeton, and with that, he became almost exactly who he wanted to be. A writer, for one thing, and a person with a certain place in the world. And I took a lesson from this. Not that you have the power to simply make up who you want to be or who you are, but that you can choose to put yourself in a new and specific place, a new and specific world, and that will change who you are. I don't know how many of you know that Ernest Hemingway was the son of a prominent Chicago surgeon. And just like the kids of any doctor, it was difficult for him to escape the belief that a doctor is what he was supposed to become. So when he graduated from high school, he didn't even go to college. You can imagine how his father felt about this. He removed himself to Paris and submerged himself in the expatriate community of artists and writers there, and ended up emerging a writer himself. Yet no one entirely reinvents himself. The recurring theme of Hemingway's Nick Carter stories, they were his first short stories and his first book, is the struggle of young Nick to establish his own identity and beliefs separate from his surgeon father. And by the end of This Boy's Life, Tobias Wolff has not escaped Concrete, Washington, and his absent alcoholic father has come out of the woodwork and inserted himself disastrously into his life. Well, after college, I too removed myself to Europe, to Oxford for 2 years to study philosophy and politics. And I put a hold on my medical school plans. I hoped to become transformed, to become a thinker, to become a professor of philosophy. But it turned out to take all of my capacity just to understand the questions the philosophers were asking, let alone offer anything like original answers. I had no natural ability in it, and though I came back a bit better educated and better traveled, I was not fundamentally changed, I thought. I spent a further year working in Washington politics, but by 1990, I was a student in medical school and right back where everyone had always predicted I would be. Day 3, Tuesday afternoon. I got my pay stub in the mail yesterday. My salary this year as a second-year resident is $33,000. My fellow residents, scrimping to pay off their $100,000 loans, chafe at this. Fortunately for me, my parents put me through school, and even with a wife and kids to provide for, I've got it better than most. When this is all over, though, we're all looking at making good money. New general surgeons start at well over $150,000 a year. The average American doctor makes over $200,000. 20% of cardiac surgeons make $500,000 a year or more. Many doctors say that before managed care, they used to do even better. It seems hard to complain, though. Are doctors paid too much or too little? There'll never be a good answer to this question. 2 years ago, my eldest child, Walker, needed heart surgery. His surgeon was incredible, operating on him in the day, and then, when he bled, again in the night. Walker survived a condition that until recently killed most children. I'd pay his surgeon $1 million myself. I've thought about going into cardiac surgery myself, but the truth is I couldn't do it no matter how much I got paid. After finishing my 100-hour-a-week general surgery residency, I have to put in more years in a 120-hour-a-week cardiac surgery fellowship. And given my meandering course before I got to medical school, I'd be over 40 years old at the end of training. Once in practice, the hours would not get a lot better from what I'd observed. I may have chosen the surgical life, but I still harbored hopes of seeing my kids someday. I'd like to stay married as well. I've already seen too many residents' marriages fall apart under the pressures. Surgeon spouses have to be pretty independent and put up with moodiness, 2 a.m. phone calls, and dashed weekend plans. The female surgeons have it especially tough. How well do you think husbands tolerate this kind of existence? Surgeons are nearly twice as likely to divorce as the average doctor, and the average doctor is more likely to divorce than the general population to begin with. There's actually a study on this, if you can believe it. For those of you looking to marry a doctor, psychiatrists have the highest divorce rate. Surprise, surprise. Surgeons are the second highest. Pediatricians are the lowest. Oddly, doctors who had a parent die while they were in medical school appear to have an unusually low divorce rate. I know 2 residents who killed themselves this year. But now this is getting too grim. This morning, my 20-something-year-old splenectomy patient was combative and talking nonsense. He's developed a fever. His oxygen levels were low, and this made him confused. Since he was confused, he wouldn't keep an oxygen mask on. I got angry with him, and he finally kept it on. An x-ray showed he had pneumonia. I hadn't prodded him out of bed enough. That would have made him take full breaths and cough up the junk in his lungs. I had the nurses bang on his chest to loosen up the pneumonia and browbeat him to cough. I started antibiotics. If it gets any worse, he'll need to be put in intensive care. I hope he turns the corner. I chose surgery because I thought it would make me more like the kind of person I was trying to be and wanted to be. I loved the technique. I loved the chance to use my hands and the blood and guts of it all. But the predicament of surgery was what attracted me, and the character of those who could deal with that predicament well. Surgeons are faced constantly with unknowns. Information is inadequate. The science is ambiguous. Your knowledge and abilities are never perfect. The risks of unforeseen consequences and terrible mistakes always loom, and yet they are able to act. Sometimes wrong, never in doubt, people say about surgeons, and it's meant as a reproof. But this seemed to me their strength, the ability of the best surgeons, like the best politicians, to make good decisions under conditions of uncertainty and live with the consequences. I, on the other hand, always had a tendency to indecision. My favorite New Yorker cartoon was the one of the gravestone that said, "He kept his options open." So I put myself in the surgical world, where decisiveness is valued not despite the stakes being high, but because they are. Day 4, Wednesday evening. Wednesdays begin early like any other day, but operations are put back 2 hours for teaching conferences. The residents gather for a couple hours of discussion on exciting matters like when and how to remove a segment of the liver and how to evaluate trauma victims for multiple injuries, are topics for the day. I gnawed a bagel to stay awake. I was up late last night putting together the presentation I had to give at this afternoon's cancer conference. I was assigned to talk about a patient with testicular cancer. Here are a few things I learned. Testicular cancer is the most common cancer for males aged 15 to 35. For unknown reasons, the testicular cancer rate for whites has doubled in the last 20 years, while for blacks it has held steady. As with breast self-exams for females, males are supposed to examine their own testicles monthly, starting in high school. How-to brochures for boys abound. Gosh, thanks, Doc. After an orchiectomy, the excision of a testicle, patients used to have the option of having a prosthetic ball put in place, usually made of silicone. With all the lawsuits against silicone breast implant manufacturers, however, the plastic balls have been pulled off the market. And this reminded me that one year, while I was in high school, my pediatrician mother performed the football team's physical exams. Half the kids spent the week afterward avoiding me. The other half would stop me in the hallway and say things like, "Hey, Gawande, your mom felt my balls, man." My father is a urologist. His patients always used to surprise me with the same kind of unabashedness. When I was about 10, a grateful patient took me and my dad out shooting in the thick hills outside our town. We'd barely hopped out of his truck and gotten the rifles down from the rack before he mentioned that he had a new problem. "Well, let's take a look," my dad said. Our host happily dropped his pants. He started to urinate, and out came a little whoosh of air. "I keep pissing air, Doc." Anybody know the diagnosis? Diverticular fistula. My dad stood watching. His interest piqued. He said he'd need to do some tests that week. Up went the pants. The patient fired off a few shots, and that was that. In my big case today, I helped an attending surgeon excise a cancer from a 35-year-old man's upper arm. It looked like a shark bit him when we were done. The plastic surgeons had to come in and use skin and muscle from his back to fill in the space. My splenectomy patient turned the corner today. Pushing him to get out of bed and walk worked, or maybe we just got lucky. His fevers persist, but his oxygen levels are up, and he's thinking clearly again. His pneumonia is in retreat. Despite all our badgering, he was surprisingly grateful today. So in 1996, when I was a second-year resident, the year before I wrote this sequence of pieces, a friend joined up to start Slate magazine. This was, as I said, before the internet was a big deal. The magazine had about, maybe a few thousand readers, and he had a hard time convincing his real journalist friends to write for the magazine. And so he began begging his fake journalist friends to write stuff for him. The very first thing I got to do, actually, was there were hearings on Persian Gulf War syndrome right after the Iraq War, and Jake, my friend, asked if I would write about that. I didn't try to do anything special. I just wrote about it, and he and the editor made me rewrite the piece twice, which I'd never done before. I'd never rewritten anything in my life, so even just the concept of rewriting was hard for me to get over. It seemed awfully painful for such a piddly thing. But in the end, they liked it, and I kind of did too. And that led to that sequence of writing, and then a series of columns that we called the Medical Examiner. It seemed like it was a way for me to stay up on the policy issues that I was interested in without a huge investment of time, which I didn't have as a resident. And it was also a way to think through, I found, issues that I was uncertain about or wanted to know about. My first few articles included not only this diary, another one was called The Unkindest Cut, about, of all things, a law that then Texas Governor George W. Bush had passed and signed, allowing rapists to be freed if they agreed to either surgical or medical castration. Another was about the debate over for-profit hospitals, another defending irradiation of meat. Many of those first articles focused on policy questions. But I began to use that column to test questions that nagged me in my everyday medical life, or I just thought seemed cool. I wrote a couple inevitable articles on sleep deprivation of residents and on alternative medicine, as well as a perhaps less tiresome article about all of us residents trying to avoid the Friday the 13th shift in the ER. The column also became my way of learning to write. I basically did 30 columns, and it was like doing 30 gallbladders in a row with an expert standing across from you, these fantastic editors who would tell me what I was doing well and what I wasn't doing well. England, it had turned out, changed me after all. When I was there, I had met aspiring writers and journalists. They were ordinary, specific people, and it did not seem so daunting to consider being among them, even if I had never written a professional word. I'd met these people. They had food on their face at lunch, you know. They also became connections for me, something that counts more enormously and subtly than I ever knew. So that was where I met Jacob, that Slate editor, for example. And about a year into my writing, I learned through another friend, because out there I'd met Malcolm Gladwell, who was visiting Jacob, who hadn't yet started writing himself. And we became friends. And he mentioned that a New Yorker editor he'd met at a cocktail party had been discussing one of my articles I had written on Slate. You ought to write him a letter. Okay, I will. And that New Yorker editor gave me a chance to try writing a piece for him. I suggested one about a neural network program that could diagnose heart attacks better than cardiologists, and a hernia factory in Toronto doing hernias better than anywhere else in the world. And the question in my own mind, the uncertainty I hoped to resolve in writing the article, was what makes a doctor good? He told me to give it a try, and so I did. It was painful to write. I thought rewriting twice was a lot. I turned in my first draft in November 1997. I'd gone through dozens of articles about neural networks. I'd flown up to Toronto to visit that hernia factory. The editor, this young, brilliant, mumbling kind of guy, was not impressed. He had a very nice way of saying this. This is a good start, he'd said. I can see you're on the right track. It's hard to describe what a good editor does, and I hadn't really realized until I worked with him, but it serves as a kind of coach along the way. Shows you ways to do what you do better. And the principal problem was I hadn't learned how to be vivid in my writing. As he put it, I described all the studies and the wonderful results that this place had, but the reader never saw anything. What does an EKG printout actually look like? What does a Schuldeis surgeon look like? How exactly is a hernia done? He wanted the video, the steady cam, he called it. And that was crucial advice for me. I began to learn. Coaches also nag, and when I felt I finally had the piece perfect, he made me do it all over again. We went through 5 full drafts of the piece, 22 drafts in total. I worked at it over about 9 months before they finally accepted it, and then came back to me and said, "We're nearly there. I just want you to cut 1,000 more words." And I couldn't have done that without the same kind of mentorship I had in the operating room, coming to me through people like these folks who are willing to give you the time and learn. I've written essays now for The New Yorker for 15 years. I suggested another one after that first piece came out, and then another, and at some point along the way I stopped writing for Slate and they let me be a staff writer there. I've tried to give them 4 articles a year, and then a couple of years into it, I pulled several of the first ones together into that first book, Complications. I did it again with a second book, Better. The unexpected turn for me, that was plenty unexpected. The unexpected turn for me was that the writing opened up new avenues as a doctor. The third article I wrote for them was called When Doctors Make Mistakes, and it was about a case where I had nearly killed a patient. I just got lucky, my butt was saved by an enterprising anesthesiologist. But I'd nearly killed a patient trying to do an emergency tracheotomy and failing to get them an airway. And it led me to think hard about what was wrong with the way we make mistakes when we make the same kinds of mistakes over and over again. And that led to this bifurcated course where I began writing about how systems work and don't work in medicine, but then began doing research on it as well. I became interested not just in observing the problems, but trying to solve some of them. A year or so after that, I made an invention. I came up with a group of people, a barcoding system to prevent sponges from being left in people, and then watched it go out into the world and become something that now reaches lots of people. And then we designed other systems and found you could make it work. And then the World Health Organization asked us to tackle a problem around reducing deaths in surgery. And that led to meeting people who helped me think about how engineers would look at these problems. And that led me to discover how the checklist came in aviation and began changing ideas. And it started just going full circle. And suddenly I was writing my next book about these concepts I discovered that I was starting to do research on. But that's now where it is. This odd sense that there's no lines, that the patients that I get to see and take care of lead to puzzles and questions. And some of them are best answered by the explorations you can do in writing. But others are best explored by actually trying to figure out what the data is, what the numbers might tell you, or what experiments might show you. These are all just forms of investigation. And so I think it's perhaps a little odd I find myself doing this combination of writing and systems engineering and running a research center. But I don't think it's any more odd than that initial decision to cut people's bodies open. Day 5, a Thursday evening. Another night on duty, the day was like usual. My first case was an operation on a woman with escalating attacks of belly pain. Gallstones were causing the pain, so we removed her gallbladder, which was chock full of them, laparoscopically, meaning using a small camera and long instruments inserted through tiny incisions in her belly. My first year doing this, I'd stare at the TV screen and try to keep the camera still with one hand while picking at the gallbladder with the other. Move one way with your hand, and the instrument moved the other way on the screen. I thought the operation was maddening, and the attending thought I was. His patient would soon give out and switch sides. He'd take the reins. Like learning a new video game, though, I eventually got the hang of it. Today, I got it done in an hour, and the attending only had to give me a few tips here and there. By the end of the day's operations, I was puffed up and gleaming with self-satisfaction. Don't Mr. me, buddy. I'm Dr. Gawande. This, of course, was not going to last long. 7 p.m., rounds are over. One team member left operating. The others fill me in on their patients. Things seem under control, and they head home. 7:01 p.m., Page, your new patient's here. What new patient? I go meet him, and he's yellow as a banana. He turns out to have been just diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It's inoperable. I start doing the paperwork to get him admitted. 7:25 p.m., I rush downstairs before the cafeteria closes. Dinner is fried chicken and mashed potatoes. I think the cafeteria manager gets kickbacks from cardiology. 7:27 p.m., Page, a nurse says there's a man on the phone who's furious that we're sending his wife home tomorrow. I say to make him wait, but she puts him on the phone anyway. This is crazy, he says. In Russia, she would get 1 month in the hospital. I note that she's eating, walking around, and taking only pain pills. He vows not to pick her up until he feels she's ready. Whatever. I return to my chicken. 7:29 p.m., an overhead speaker blares, code green. This means someone's stopped breathing. I abandon dinner and join a platoon of residents descending on a man who had a lung removed because of cancer. One resident inserts a breathing tube through his vocal cords. Another puts him on a respirator. 7:45 p.m., I'm back to my chicken, and another page comes. Mrs. Z is itchy all over. I ask if she has a rash. The nurse puts me on hold. 7:48 p.m., still on hold. I hang up and call back. Oh yeah, she forgot me. Yes, the patient does have a rash. I figured she has an allergy and change her antibiotics. 7:50 p.m., a page. Mrs. B isn't making enough urine. I head for the floor. This time I bring the chicken. She's pale, dizzy, and dehydrated. Her blood count's low. I give her some blood. 8:10 p.m., Page. My splenectomy patient has a fever running to 102 and is throwing up. Damn it. I thought he was on the mend. I go to see him. He cusses at me. The pneumonia is still festering. I give him Tylenol and anti-nausea medicine to make him feel a little bit better. 8:25 p.m., my ego back to puny resident size. I sneak off to my call room, a closet with a bed and a desk. I finish off the chicken and call home to find out how my wife, Kathleen, and the kids are doing. Another page, and I gird myself for a long night ahead. My splenectomy patient recovered from his pneumonia and made it home for exactly 1 day. He then returned with a new fever that proved to be from a disseminated fungal infection, the result of a weakened immune system from his lymphoma and chemotherapy. 3 weeks later, he died, and he was just 23 years old. I thank you. I understand we have time for questions, or not, whatever the appropriate.
Absolutely extraordinary stories within readings within readings. Yeah, we do have time for a few questions. We've got some roving microphones.
Yes, what do you think of fall regulations vis-a-vis resident education? I trained when you trained, and it's very different today.
Yeah, and it changed my chief year, which I thought was totally unfair, because now I suddenly had to cover for my residents doing 80 hours a week instead of 110 hours a week. But I was a supporter, and I've remained that way. Now, the trouble is getting it right, but there have been a couple of aspects to it. Number one is that we ought to be able to figure out how to train people and while making them work 80 hours a week. It's still a pretty tough job. And I have not had the difficulty that our residents, we have to kick them out. You know, if we start to lose the ethic of commitment, that is a serious problem, but that's about our culture and not the hours we pound into people. The second part of it, though, that I think is really important is I mentioned those suicides. And, there were 7 of us in my class, and mine was the only marriage left. The number of people who are incredibly talented who left surgery because it couldn't work for their lives, the people we drove crazy, the people that toll is horrendous. And the place we've come to now is one where, in the current graduating class of my hospital, 4 out of 7 are women. 3 of them have had children along the way. We were writing off a huge part of the talent pool because they simply couldn't make part of that family life work. And we needed to move into a world where we can make it possible. That said, the notion that the 80-hour work week and the reduction of hours and reduction of sleep deprivation is saving lots of lives remains incredibly controversial, because there's been no evidence that the programs that instituted it or made it work, that they've succeeded, because you're trading off the handoffs from one person to the next, who may or may not be able to follow along, for the lack of the improvement in sleep that people have had. So it's an interesting, difficult puzzle. But I think one where we ought to be able to make systems that work and make it possible for people to have lives.
Considering kind of the changing state of healthcare and medicine today, do you think you would still choose to pursue medicine, or are there different issues that you would address?
Absolutely would choose it. This, change to some people is frightening, and I think there is a big generational difference, because when you survey people about whether they would go into medicine again, and especially if they would go into their specialties again, the negative surveys can be pretty depressing. Large numbers of physicians saying they wouldn't go in and advising lots of young people not to go in. On the other hand, I think we recognize that, especially in the last few years, that practicing the medicine the way we have practiced medicine doesn't work. And a lot of the pressures that we blame on bureaucracy or on insurance companies and others really come from the discovery of a huge volume of knowledge and capability that our systems that Lewis Thomas was writing about many years ago have simply broken down. I loved his book, The Youngest Science, and he describes what it was like to be an intern at Boston City Hospital in the 1930s. And at that time, you really could know and do everything yourself. I mean, he took the sputum samples, he'd do the gram stain, he'd look under the microscope, he'd figure out the diagnosis, and then for the 5 things that you could actually do something about, he knew what to do. Now we have 4,000 medical and surgical procedures, 6,000 drugs, 13,000 different ways the human body can fail. And then we're moving to ICD-10, which looks like 68,000 different ways that we classify the human body to be able to fail. And then we add the genomics, which is going to make it millions of ways that the human body can fail, and you have to figure out how to make it work. And the complexities and the skills required have meant that when my mother went into the hospital for her knee replacement, 63 different people were involved in her care in the course of a 3-day stay. And suddenly, skills like teamwork and coordination and communication are hugely important, because if the person who sees you in the morning makes one plan and the person who sees in the afternoon makes another plan, it's disaster, and you, the patient, fall through the cracks. The frustrations of making a system work that's built on a model that valued autonomy and compartmentalization can get blamed on that system. But the young people that I get to work with in our laboratory are excited about the prospect to, blow up and reinvent that system, use information technologies in cool ways, make teams work together in completely different strategies, start figuring out how you can take care of people without the office visit, and use lots of ways to connect back and forth. So there's actually more people applying to medical school than ever before in history. The competitiveness is through the roof. I would not have gotten into Harvard Medical School now. I was applying when there was 1.8 applicants per spot, and now there's 3.8 applicants per spot nationwide for medical schools. So I don't think young people have given up on medical schools, and they shouldn't. It's undergoing tremendous change, and that's opportunity right now.
I'm curious to know, if you wouldn't mind telling us how your peers, how other surgeons have reacted to your writings, especially when you're particularly open about near misses, failures, the lifestyle. Can you speak a little bit about this, please? Thank you.
I was a little nervous about it. I have this tendency to just write without thinking too much about how people might think of it, and then I'll see it on the page, and then I'll start. I remember when I wrote When Doctors Make Mistakes, it went to the printer on Friday afternoon, and I immediately called my editor back like, no, we got to stop it. And in the end, the reaction was extremely positive. There's always a few detractors, and I always remember them. But on the whole, the striking thing was they didn't boot me out of Harvard, they hired me. And they gave me a lot of support for thinking about and getting to expand on the kinds of ideas and opportunities that were coming out of it. So, and as it's gone further, it's also been the case that I think what I was writing about were tensions and puzzles that a lot of people were feeling. And I wasn't throwing a bomb. I was asking a very basic question that I think we were all asking ourselves, or we all ask ourselves as we do our work, which is, how do you get good at what you do? What does it mean to be good at this thing where you can't even know all the knowledge there is you're supposed to have, where you're supposed to deal with people in all the myriad ways that they exist, pull science into it, and make the science actually come alive and be meaningful in people's lives? And none of that struggle was in the textbooks. So what I found was lots of people like you who seem to say, hey, that's okay. I'll even bring you down to New York to get to talk about it.
Since you began by writing about public policy issues, I wonder if you might share with us your perspectives on the Affordable Care Act.
3 minutes left, right?
2.
2, all right. So I break it down in 2 ways. One is, it has been a century-long struggle to commit ourselves to equity, to the belief that anybody who can benefit in their lives from the discoveries that we've made over this last century deserves to have access to that care regardless of their ability to pay. We committed to that for the over 65 population. We committed to that for people, young to women and pregnant women and children in poverty. We've committed that to veterans. So we've kind of carved up these folks and said, well, these swaths, the self-employed, no, you don't deserve this stuff. Or if you work for if you work for a restaurant, you don't deserve this stuff. And I think that commitment to equity was what got reflected in just the passage of the law. Then there's the inevitable headache of the fact that you have to make it viable and work. And I've never been one who believes there is a single way to success. I feel like after looking at all the different ways, say in Europe or elsewhere, that the pathways you have a Medicare-like system in Canada, you have a VA-like system in Britain, you have a private insurance universal coverage system in Germany and in Switzerland. And each one has made their own distinctive way of navigating the politics of how you put it all together. And that's what we have done. The further question, which is a global struggle right now, is how do you make it possible to stay affordable? And in every country, the costs of care are surging faster than their economies. And we're all grappling with, once you've committed to equity, then you lose that safety valve of saying, well, the way we'll deal with the costs is just throw more people into the street. 8 years ago in Massachusetts, we committed to this, and so we've been walking down this road of trying to figure out how you keep the costs under control without sacrificing quality. And I think that is the struggle that will be on for the next 20 years. This next generation of work is making systems work in healthcare. And the political battles of it being left versus right are just, to me, tiresome and painful. They have much more to do with power and politics right now than they do with solving these problems. But for all of that, all of the focus on the heat inside the Beltway in Washington, since the passage of ACA, there's been just this incredible flowering of innovation in the ways that healthcare is being delivered and works in north of the Mason-Dixon line, south of the Mason-Dixon line. There's incredible things, and I've been surprised at how few writers are taking on that story. And so I kind of get to have it not entirely myself. There are a few people out there, but surprisingly few, and I can pretty much get to walk around and just say what is changing and what's happening. And there's a lot, and I think that story is being missed and is important to tell. Thank you all.